there in order to break the back of the movement, make an example of it as to the cost and consequence of actually trying to stand on your rights as an American Indian.
We started our own programs too. You know, the American Indian movement, we started, but we patterned them after the Black Panthers organizations. We had free breakfasts, we built schools, we have our own clinics. We went into, of course, communications. A lot of the things that the Panthers did, we patterned our ideas off of.
The women from Pine Ridge begged the AIM people to send a sizable group of people who could be there to protect them in their, you know, these very isolated little compounds of these full-blood Indians, elder people. They were getting harassed all the time by the goons. And these two FBI agents drove right in at high speed, freaked everyone out, and so, you know, there was a firefight, and those two FBI agents ended up dead.
Peltier was convicted of killing two FBI agents in a firefight in June of '75 on Pine Ridge. The upshot, however, is that there's no one, including even his prosecutors at trial, that have been able to say, or willing to say, at any point in the last 25 years, as it stands right now, that they actually know that he did what he was convicted of doing. In most cases, they're not even willing to say they believe he did what he was convicted of doing.
Of course, a big movement built up, and Leonard has become not only a symbol, but a true spiritual leader, you know, of the whole movement. And AIM, you know, is weakened beyond really existing, but the American Indian movement, without the dots, you know, without the acronym, has largely survived.
What you can say is that Leonard Peltier is not serving time, although his sentence is 2 consecutive life terms in prison. He's not in prison at this point for anything resulting from a valid conviction. He is in prison as a symbol of the arbitrary ability of the federal government to visit these kinds of consequences on American Indians first and foremost, because that's what he represents, Indian resistance, pursuit of Indian rights. But more broadly, he's a symbol of the cost and consequence the government wants you to believe it can impose for your standing, no matter who you are, what group you represent. Attempting to stand on your rights can put you in a cage next to Leonard Peltier. Think about it.
Much of the Southwest, including Texas, California, Colorado, and other states, were part of Mexico until the Mexican-American War in the late 1840s, when the U.S. military stole the land from Mexico. This history of conquest, the idea of an occupied land, and a culture of resistance have played a central role in the ongoing struggles of Chicano-Mexicano people. In the 1960s, amidst demands in the farm worker fields for immigrant rights, on campuses and in city barrios, the movement gathered strength and gave birth to dynamic leaders. Less well known than some of the other crimes of Cointel Pro are those committed against the Chicano-Mexicano movements.
Cointel Pro probably just didn't hit us in Colorado. It hit us in Nuevo Mexico. It hit us in California.
You know, the Mexican people have always resisted. There was a war, it was between unequals, and there was a conquest. And that's the root of relations between the Mexican people in the United States and the federal government.
I would suggest that anybody who is an active organizer in the community that's making social change would quickly become a target of the United States government.
You go into New Mexico and you have Linda Montoya at Escuela Aslan, an alternative school that's created she's killed by the police in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And then you go into the assassination of Rito Canales and Antonio Cordova of the Black Berets that were set up by the police. And these guys were brittle. They were shot like 30-some times, you know, on the pretext that they were trying to steal dynamite.
Widespread attacks on the Chicano movement in the Southwest continued. In 1974, in Boulder, Colorado, during an upsurge in the Chicano student movement, 6 young activists were killed in 2 separate car bombings. They are called Los Seis de Boulder and are honored to this day.
We lost a lot of leadership and we lost a lot of potential. And beyond the individuals who died, the spirit kind of died there.
Although Cointel Pro was a federal program, the FBI and other federal agencies worked in close coordination with local police and encouraged right-wing vigilantes, launching joint attacks, infiltrations, and surveillance. One example of this use of right-wing groups is the assassination of Ricardo Falcón, a promising young Chicano leader who sought to build greater unity.
He could move the people in the prisons. He could move the people in the barrios, and he could move the students. So to me, he was a real example of what was coming.
In 1972, a right-wing vigilante named Perry Brunson shot and killed 22-year-old Ricardo Falcón. Falcón was riding in a car with other activists to a Chicano political party convention in El Paso, Texas. When the car overheated, they stopped at a gas station in Oro Grande, New Mexico.
The owner of the gas station comes out and he says to the group, "You Chicano motherfuckers are all alike." And he walks back into the station. So Ricardo says to the group, "I'm going to go in and see what's going on with this guy and pay for the water." As he walks into the gas station, he opens the door. Perry Brunson's inside the counter. Inside and in front of him is a counter. And he reaches into the counter and pulls out a .38 and shoots Ricardo 5 times. And so then Ricardo attempts to reach over and pull the gun from him. One of the gentlemen that's out in the car hears the gunshots. He runs in, and he then wrestles Perry Brunson to the ground for the gun. Ricardo has turned around and walked out of the gas station and then collapses, and he bleeds to death.
The man who assassinated Ricardo Falcón was an organizer for the American Independent Party. In his gas station, the day of Ricardo Falcón's murder, he had a petition there for people who wanted to sign to have George Wallace's name put on the ballot in New Mexico in November of 1972.
Brunson was acquitted by an all-white jury and never spent a day in jail. Supporters have attempted to obtain Cointel Pro documents about Ricardo Falcón.
I think that the activities that Ricardo Falcón was involved in, the organizing of students in Boulder, the bringing of the community together, the empowering of people in northern Colorado, I think are some of the key factors that led to his assassination in Oro Grande.
I participated in the trial. I saw some of the evidence, and I'm convinced that Ricardo Falcón, it was no coincidence that he was killed in Oro Grande.
Throughout all these years, I filed for his Freedom of Information files, and I have yet to receive one document from the government. They refuse to release any of the records concerning his Freedom of Information file.
Today, here we are looking at it some 30 years ago, 35 years ago, 40 years ago almost. And some of these things say, oh my God, how can you believe that those things could have ever happened? Well, I'll tell you what, the federal government thought they could have happened because they wouldn't have done some of the things that they did.
Cointel Pro targeted many movements and damaged people and organizations, from the Puerto Rican, Native American, and Chicano movements to the mostly white left, the huge anti-war movement, and student groups like Students for a Democratic Society. In many ways, these movements grew out of the energy and inspiration of the civil rights movement, first in the South and then throughout the country. It was the leaders of the civil rights and Black liberation movements who J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI thought represented the greatest threat had the most potential to bring unity to and transform the many movements into a force united and powerful enough to overthrow the established order. That was why Cointel Pro infamously included a list of Black leaders to be neutralized. It was within this context that the assassinations of Malcolm X and then Martin Luther King Jr. took place. Massive rebellions took place in African American communities in many cities. As repression intensified, a more militant Black liberation movement emerged. Vicious tactics, trumped-up charges, and calculated assassinations were unleashed against SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, against the Black Panther Party, and against RAM, the Revolutionary Action Movement.
Life magazine put out in June, I think, of 1966, the plot to get Whitey. All right. And in it is stated that I was head of 1,000 blood brothers across the country that was planning to wage guerrilla warfare.
Of course, the Black Liberation Movement is a priority at that time because the Black Liberation Movement and the quote-unquote Black Rebellion in the country at that time was gaining some significant momentum.
Cointel Pro was a governmental conspiracy to liquidate the revolutionary leadership of Black America because we were impacting upon the whole country. And the leadership had to be liquidated even up to Dr. King, because Dr. King had changed.
People don't talk about it in those terms right now. We kind of equate and collapse everything into civil rights. But there was a more militant movement, a movement that was reaching out to global politics in terms of anti-imperialism at that particular moment, and it had tremendous potential.
The Black Panther Party was only a small manifestation of what this infrastructure wanted to do. I'm talking about SNCC. Came up with these brilliant ideas, you know, that had nothing to do with a Huey Newton or a Bobby Seale. We were organizing in the South, in the West, in the East, the symbol of the Panther from the Mississippi Freedom and Democratic Party, Fannie Lou Hamer, all these people I knew I'm growing up with and we see.
If you're right, you have to stand on that principle, and if it's necessary to die on the principle, because I am sick of the racist war in Vietnam when we don't have justice in the United States.
The militant aspects it's already there from the deacons on. This is what you did. We grew up in a Black nation, a nation that had to protect itself.
We are concerned about the survival of Black people in this country, and that we cannot survive if we go fight some yellow man in Vietnam who ain't never called us nigger.
The government saw it as a Black Marxist movement growing in the North. We were independent of the Communist Party. We were independent of the Socialist Workers' Party. We were independent of all left groups that they had already infiltrated. It was growing.
But you also had the Chicano movement developing, Asian American, anti-imperialist, national liberation consciousness type movement. In the Puerto Rican community, you had the development of that, as well as with white students and white youth in the formation of SDS and other radical white organizations in that moment. So, you know, in terms of the development of a different type of politics, it scared the hell out of the United States government at that particular moment. And that's why counterinsurgency was developed at that level.